Rabbi Nitzan Stein-Kokin. I'm the rabbi of Bethel congregation here in Phoenix. And I'm excited that on such a nice, normal Thursday night, we get to really learn and study things about, here in this congregation, we love to study. So I'm very pleased to have you here, Professor Rendsburg. I need this. This is Gary Rendsburg, 1,000 Years of Jewish History, the first diaspora, Egypt and Babylonia. But I also want to thank ASU and especially you, Chava Tirosh Samuelson, the head of the Jewish Studies Department at ASU, for partnering with us to bringing this program and this learning here. So I want to invite you to introduce Professor Rendsburg and welcome to Bethel.
It's wonderful to be with you here in person, and to those who are with us online. I cannot see you, but you can see me, so it's wonderful to have you online with us to this lecture series on 1,000 Years of Jewish History, and tonight is the first lecture. And again, thank you, Rabbi Stein-Kokin, for hosting us. We've done many programs with this congregation, and we are very excited to continue to do that. I'm Chava Samuelson. I'm the director of Jewish Studies at ASU. I'm Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History. And as many of you probably know, we offer courses, undergraduate and graduate courses in Jewish history, mostly Jewish history, also Jewish religion, Jewish culture. But we're also very committed to what we would call today public humanities. In other words, engaging Jewish studies with the public at large and bringing as many lectures as we could to the attention of the community here in metropolitan Phoenix. So I'm sure that some of you at least got this, so it's on your chairs. That annual report includes the calendar for this academic year. So take a look at it. We do offer many courses online like that. This is a kind of a mini course of 3 lectures, and your husband is going to give one of the lecture series on Jews, Judaism, and the arts during the Renaissance. So do take a look at this. You'll find a lot of interesting programs. So tonight we're very honored, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rendsburg. Please put it on your calendar next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, he will also give us 2 lectures, but on Zoom, not in person, but on Zoom. So Professor Rendsburg holds the Blount and Irving Laureate Chair in Jewish History in the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. He also has a position in the History Department at Rutgers University. His MA and his PhD are from New York University, and he began his academic career at Canisius College in Buffalo, New York, then spent 18 years at Cornell University and joined Rutgers University in 2004. He's the author of 6 books, 200 essays, so you're dealing with a very, very studied scholar here. His areas of expertise include the literary approaches to the Bible, the history of the Hebrew language, the history of ancient Israel, relationship between ancient Egypt and ancient Israel, of course, the Dead Sea Scroll, that's part of his work as well. And in the recent years, he moved more and more into medieval Hebrew manuscripts, or the knowledge of medieval Hebrew. In his courses, he covers the entire gamut of Jewish history and religion, but he has a special focus on the development of Judaism in the post-biblical period. I'll just mention 3 of his books to advise you to take a look at those books. So he has a book called, and one of the older books is the Bible and the Ancient Near East. That's from 1997. It's a general survey of the biblical world. A second book, which focuses on the Song of Songs, it's Solomon's Vineyard, Literary and Linguistic Studies in the Song of Songs. That's from 2009. And the most recent book, How the Bible Was Written, That's from 2019. So he specializes in all aspects of the ancient world. There are a lot of work excavating in Israel. So he participated in excavation in the Qumran site, in Tel Dor, and in Caesarea or Caesarea, as we say in English. And his work benefited for various grants and fellowships, including from the Center of Advanced Judaic Studies at University of Pennsylvania and the National Endowment of the Humanities. So tonight's lecture focuses on the first diasporas, Egypt and Babylonia. Now, to people on the Zoom call, please put your questions at the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Try not to use the chat, but do it in the Q&A. And Alicia Kaplan is going to read at least some of the questions and pose the questions to our speaker. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rendsburg to Phoenix and to this end.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and attending and participating. But first, personal thanks to the ASU staff, Lisa and Chava, for your good work, and also Rabbi Stein-Koken for hosting us here at Bethel. And the real reason I'm here in Phoenix is because of Stacy McKinnon and Kessie Tony, who live in Sun City West, who've been my hosts, and just thank you for all that you've been doing and making my stay here this week so enjoyable. I've been speaking throughout the week at Phoenix Seminary, 2 local churches, here, Beth Emet in Sun City as well. So it's just been a wonderful opportunity to get to know the whole Phoenix area and share our knowledge of the ancient world and ancient Israel in particular with diverse audiences. So I'm so pleased to now be presenting this evening here through ASU, but here at the Bethel congregation. Okay. We're not going to do 1,000 years of Jewish history tonight. That would be too much of a speed reading. But over the course of these 3 lectures, we will cover 1,000 years, looking at different elements of the period of Jewish history from the destruction of the first temple, that's where we're starting today, 586 BCE, and going forward 1,000 years until around 600 or 400, 500, 600 CE, a bit more than 1,000 probably. And the first diasporas are Egypt and Babylonia. I'm going to assume that you know a good amount of the biblical account, or the basics of it, which is that in 586 BCE, actually 11 years prior to that, the Babylonians arrived in the land of Israel, specifically the kingdom of Judah, and under their famous King Nebuchadnezzar, and they began to deport and exile the people of the kingdom of Judah. And this is all described in relatively good detail at the end of the book of 2 Kings, which is what you see here. So there was the first exile or first deportation of 597, and 11 years later, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the entirety of the population, or at least the majority of the population, was exiled to Babylonia. This is a map which gives you an indication of the route they would have taken. And the first thing that you may say is, well, why didn't they just go due east from Jerusalem to Babylonia? Well, that is one massive desert, which is indicated on the map as the Arabian Desert. Do you people know anything about the desert here in Arizona? You cannot cross the desert there. You would die en route. And you may say, well, why did the Babylonians care if a bunch of defeated Judeans died? Well, the Babylonians escorting them would have died as well. So we know what the trade routes and so on were in the ancient world, and you're seeing here on the map. You head north from the land of Canaan or the land of Israel, and then you can head east through, you can make it out through Damascus and Tadmor, which are, especially Tadmor, a major oasis site, or you can continue further north and then hit the Euphrates further north and eventually take the Euphrates downstream to Babylon. And the Bible describes in various geographical terms, so we know pretty sure how they made the journey. what was awaiting them when they got to Babylon? Now, Israel was a relatively minor player in the ancient world. The great powers were Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, the Hittites, eventually the Persians, who we'll talk about, and the Greeks, and so on. And Israel's a pretty small people, somewhat insignificant on the geopolitical scale. Their public buildings were relatively small as well. Even the largest buildings in Jerusalem, the capital city, which would be the palace of the king, and even larger, the temple to God, were relatively small compared to the great wonders of Egypt and Babylonia. Imagine that these Jewish exiles get to Babylon and they see this. This is the famous Ishtar Gate, now in the Berlin Museum, excavated in Babylon by German archaeologists around 1900. And it is an absolute gem of great ancient engineering, art, and architecture. And to give you a sense of how tall it is, there are some people standing there. The truth is, by the way, that a good portion of this is reconstructed, okay? It wasn't found like this, okay? And even some of the bricks were made by modern German brick makers and glazed to match the ones that actually were found. That aside, it is a remarkable structure. How many of you have been to the Berlin? It's in the Pergamon Museum. Great. Okay. Some of the detail of this brickwork, just as an aside, nothing to do with Jewish history per se, but it's always interesting to point these things out. In Israel, they built from stone. In Egypt, they built from stone. If you've been to Egypt and gone to the temples. In Mesopotamia, they built out of brick. They didn't have stone. They didn't have a quantity of limestone quarries, but there's alluvial clay up and down the Tigris and Euphrates Valley so that you use bricks. Okay. And just look at some of these, real animals or, mythical animals. Now, this part of biblical history is well described, not only in the book of Kings, but in other books, including the book of Jeremiah, who is the prophet who was alive at this time. This is a famous letter that Jeremiah writes in chapter 29, that he writes to the people in Babylon. Jeremiah is still in Jerusalem, and we're going to come to his story in the second half of our talk as well, but he's still in Jerusalem. And he writes a letter. He's the prophet speaking the word of God. And so as you see here in verse 4, he speaks for God. And in verse 5, he says, this is what you should be doing in exile. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters. And take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. If I had to sum that up in a simple sentence, build and construct a normal life for yourself, right? This is the theologically, the prophets of Israel and the other writers of the other biblical books understood the exile as God's punishment of the people for their wayward ways, engaging in polytheistic worship, not upholding the laws of the Torah, not upholding the poor, not defending the underprivileged, and so on. And so this is what God has in store for you, but God is telling you just go about and lead your normal lives. Exactly what you would do or were doing back in the land of Israel, but now you're in Babylonia. And then he says famously in verse 7, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord in its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. To this day, Jews continue to do this. You pray for the country in which you live. So in this congregation, I assume you say the prayer for the government of the United States, as we do in my congregation back in New Jersey. And if you're in the UK, you say the prayer for the royal family, and on it goes. That Jewish tradition can be traced back 2,600 years to this statement right here, right? Pray for the city in which you are, for the country in which you are, for if it prospers, you will prosper. And there's a great lesson to be learned in that, which still resonates. Okay, to every once in a while use a little Hebrew, ad hayom hazeh, okay, until the present day. Now, There are other prophets who actually are in exile. Jeremiah will eventually go to Egypt, coming attractions you'll see in a moment. But two prophets from the Bible, Ezekiel is amongst the exiles who leaves Jerusalem and winds up in Babylonia. And the person whom we call second Isaiah may have even been born in exile, and he is receiving the divine word as well. So these are two individual prophets who are writing during the 6th century BCE, and they received divine communication even though they are now in Babylonia. This is the beginning of the expansion of a universal God who can speak to people not only in their own land, but in diaspora communities like these two prophets who received the word of the Lord. What did the people take with them when they went into exile? Well, they could not have taken much in the way of material culture. First of all, they couldn't have taken their pots and things, their cooking pots and things like that. They're too heavy. They probably, took very little with them, a sack of some belongings. But one thing we know is that they took their scrolls with them. This, of course, is just a stock photo of some parchment scrolls that I was able to, find on the internet. If not their scrolls physically, at least in their minds, they're sacred texts. Because much of the biblical material comes to us from the time of the exile. The book of Kings most likely was compiled in the exile, because the last event described in the book of Kings is dated to 561 BCE, and that is exactly in the middle of the exilic period. But beyond that, they also took other literature with them. And how do we know that? Well, this is a famous passage from 2nd Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 65. Well, it's actually not so famous from 2nd Isaiah. He actually took the wording from the first prophet Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 11, where it's always cited as a very famous passage. And the wolf will dwell with the sheep, and the lion like the ox will eat straw, is the Isaiah chapter 11 version. And the second Isaiah prophet, who evokes the language of the first Isaiah, but he's living in exile. By the way, we know that he's living in exile because he refers to events of that time period. He refers to Jerusalem being destroyed. He refers to Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, who we'll see in a moment. And so how would he be writing these lines in chapter 65? It's because he has in his, either in a physical text written or in his personal little mental hard drive, he's able to recite to himself the text of the prophet who lived a century and a half earlier. So when Jeremiah says this, this is what he's intending, right? That the people should go on and continue to lead their lives. Now, where did they settle? This map, again, similar route as to how they got there. This map is showing you not only the city of Babylon, but in the areas around Babylon, which is where they settled. We know very little about their religious life. We do not know what they did. I mean, most famously, we have Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept. Did they recite psalms? Do they recite some like prayers? There is no evidence whatsoever for a synagogue in that area yet. The synagogue won't be created for another several hundred years. Did they build a mini temple to God because that's the best they could do? There's no evidence of that either. And besides, if they did build a temple to God, it would violate a very important biblical teaching, which is the temple can only be in Jerusalem. So we don't know what their religious lives were all about. But here are some passages from Ezekiel. He actually tells us where he was living, the Chebar Canal, in Hebrew, Al-Nahar Kavar. And we actually know that waterway from the Babylonian text. The Babylonian language is officially called Akkadian. And he tells us he's living in a place called Tel Aviv, which gets anglicized as Tel Aviv. And we know that from Babylonian texts as well. And that, of course, becomes the name of the first modern city in modern Israel, and the largest city in the country to this day. Right. Now, the exile was relatively short-lived. In 538, that is to say, only 48 years later, after the destruction of the temple. The Babylonian Empire collapsed. It was defeated by the great Persian Empire under their king or Emperor Cyrus the Great. So the Babylonian Empire ruled basically the Fertile Crescent. But at the highest extreme or the greatest extent of the Persian Empire, they ruled everything you see here. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. To the northwest rather, even parts of Greece are under Persian rule. Eventually, Alexander the Great would conquer 200 years later. But you can see the extent of the Persian Empire from Central Asia through homeland of Persia and across the Near East and into Egypt as well. Now, Cyrus the Great issues his decree and invites the Jews to return to the land of Judah, land of Israel, and Jerusalem, and to rebuild the temple. And the Bible tells that story as well. And that happens. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes about 20 years to get the temple built again. But Jerusalem is reestablished as a city rebuilt during this time period in the late 500s B.C.E. with the permission of the Persian Empire. And so they would have taken that route in the opposite direction, right back to where they came. But not all the Jews returned. Large numbers of them remained in Babylonia. We have a hint of this from the biblical text, but we now know it from actual archaeological material. What I'm going to show you is really very, very new material. There's a place in southern Iraq called Tel al-Yehuda, and it's right there near Babylon. And that actually means, Al-Yehuda means the city of the Jews. In other words, the Jewish population of that city, or the Judean population to be more accurate, the Judean population of that city was so great that it was just simply called that. When I teach this in New Jersey, I'm able to tell people, and my students and adult audiences know this, in South Jersey we have a town called Swedesboro. It was an early migration of Swedes to colonial America. It's still called Swedesboro today, right? It has Swedes. Anybody from Philadelphia originally? Right? There's a part of Philadelphia called Germantown, okay, right? A small German, obviously most people settling the Eastern Seaboard were English, but there was a small German community in Germantown. That's the equivalent of this, right? Or this is the equivalent of Swedesboro, New Jersey, Germantown, Philadelphia. So from this site, 100 plus cuneiform tablets were found, and they're in the private collection of David Sofair, a collector in London. And they're all economic texts. They're business transactions. They're commercial transactions. I'll give you a sampling. And therefore, they're all dated, because like any other contract, you have to have a date on it. And they're dated from this 1 century of 572, when, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar was still ruling, down to 478 during the time of the Persian rule, more than half of them coming from that latter part of the reign of the Persian Emperor Darius I. This, excuse me, these are these cuneiform tablets, what they look like. This is the earliest dated one, and they don't have, it doesn't say 572 BCE, right? It says year 33 of Nebuchadnezzar II. Well, since we know when his reign started, we can actually date these things very easily. Close-up of the cuneiform symbols. Everybody remembers their basic cuneiform symbols? Okay. Now, what are these tablets saying? Well, a lot of names, first of all, right? These are contractual arrangements. And what you get here is such and such a person is going to provide 60 of this and 40 of this. And if in the month of Simano he does not provide it, then he will provide instead 2 kor, some measurement of barley. Right? So it's some agreement of a grain sale. You then get witnesses, and as you see at the bottom, the date. Now, if you start looking at the names of the witnesses, you get people named Azaryahu, That's a Hebrew name. Yahu-Kulu, that's a Hebrew name, alongside Babylonian names like Nabu-Na'id and so on. We call those Hebrew names Yahwistic names. So any Hebrew name, and they come into English, with IAH on the end, or JAH on the end, like names like Zechariah, Jeremiah, Elijah, and so on, that is the shortened form of the name of God. And we call those Yahwistic names. Or that element can be at the front of the name, like in Hebrew, Yehonatan, Jonathan. So either at the front of a name, like Yahu-Kulu, or at the end of a name, like Azar-Yahu, the only people who would have names like that would, by definition, be the Judeans in exile. And here they are engaged in commercial ventures. And of the 75 such names, they equaled about 120 separate different individuals. Sometimes we have the same name, but it's the son of X, and the other one is the same name, the son of Y. They can't be the same person, but it's the same name. These cuneiform tablets are written on all sides, as you see here. Now, all of this material has come to light due to the remarkable work of two specialists in cuneiform and Babylonian studies, Laurie Pierce on the top from Berkeley, and Cornelia Wunsch, a German scholar at the University of London, there on the bottom. And together they published this incredible work, which I have back home. It's too large a volume to bring, documents of Judean exiles and West Semites, others, in Babylonia in the collection of David Sofer. And they go through one by one, this is text number 2, text number 3, putting them in chronological order. And they create, these are great photos, they have photos in the book. And they create, they transcribe them, they translate them, they explain them. This is remarkable scholarship of the most fundamental type, right? To really bring to light texts that nobody else has ever seen before. And we can create family trees, because if you have multiple generations of individuals and you know that X is the son of Y and Y is the son of Z and so on, you can actually begin to create these kinds of family trees. Now, there's a problem in the Babylonian language. There's no H sound in the Babylonian language. So when they had to say Yahoo, they typically wrote it with an M sound if it came at the end of the word, or they wrote it with a ch sound if it came at the beginning of a word. So even though this chart says Nir Yama and Yahu Aza, those are all, again, Yahwistic names. It just has to do with the writing system. They had no way of expressing an H sound because they don't have an H sound in their own language, like you would have in something like, Yehonatan and so on. So this gives us a multi-generational Jewish family. Now, sometimes when there is no divine element in the name, we still can determine that they are good Jewish people. Well, in the case of the 5 sons that you see there, 4 of them have what we call Yahwistic names, and the one who doesn't is the equivalent of Haggai, which is, again, a good biblical name, one of the prophets of the Bible. So this is how all of this has been pierced together by Wunsch and Pierce. This is all new, what they've just done. But from 100 years ago, we have another Babylonian cuneiform archive found at Nippur, slightly to the south, called the Murashu Archive. The Murashu family were businessmen, not Jewish, but they constantly are referring to their, the people who are working with them in commercial ventures are Jews. This was all found by the University of Pennsylvania excavation more than 100 years ago, and all of that material is in the Penn Museum. So Nippur is a little bit to the south, as you see here. Just to remind you that archaeology can be very dusty, and there's an old photo of the original Penn excavations, and then Chicago went back in the 1960s and did some more excavations. And they found all of these cuneiform tablets. Cuneiform tablets are almost indestructible, right? They're not biodegradable. They won't burn up in a fire. They're not like papyrus or parchment, much of which has been lost to us. So they remain, and we're able to read them. And so 1898, a German scholar at Penn, Hermann Hilprecht, published one set, and then another American scholar, Albert Clay, published another set. And again, Jewish personal names appearing throughout. So what were the Jews doing in Babylonian exile? They took Jeremiah's message to heart. They reconstructed their lives. They did not go back to Jerusalem when they had the opportunity to do so. And you have all of these individuals here with these personal names that reflect their Jewish roots. And again, on the bottom there, by the way, you see the equivalent of Jonathan, Yehonatan. You see the equivalent of Shimon or Simeon. And you see somebody named Shabbatai. A Jewish tradition, boys born on Shabbat are frequently called Shabbatai. And there's such a person here already in the 5th century BCE. Here's some pictures of these tablets. One individual, Yishrib Yahu, therefore definitely Jewish, son of Piliyahu, he is referred to as the chief officer of the serfs of the royal treasury. So that's pretty high up in the Persian administration, right? Not quite secretary of the treasury, but pretty high up in the administration. What are they doing? Same kind of thing, business transactions. This one is a canal rental. The Tigris and Euphrates flow more or less parallel to one another. But the Babylonians dug canals to connect the two rivers. And those canals become important commercial ventures to get trade from this place to that that place. So somebody owns the canal, and then you can rent the canal and pay a tariff, as it were, or a fee or a toll, whatever you want to call it, no different than when a ship goes through the Suez Canal today, or the Panama Canal today, right? The ships have to pay Egypt or Panama some amount of money to traverse the canal. And so that's what's happening here. And again, if you look at all the names in the first paragraph, lots of Jewish names are present. And they're telling you about what we're going to do. We're going to rent the canal. And in the third to bottom line, we will give you 700 core of barley a year for the ability to rent the canal, and then we can collect the fees, right? Having fun with this, everybody? And again, another Jewish family that we can reconstruct based on those documents. This is my favorite. This is actually in a private collection of a collector named Shlomo Messiah, whom I'll show you in just a moment. He actually passed away. These are relatively small tablets. So somebody is selling a calf, right? The sale of a calf from this person, a woman, the daughter of this person, to this man, the son of this man, okay? Now, why would you buy a calf? Well, you're hoping that the calf will grow up either to be a strong ox, if you castrate it, or a stud bull if you don't castrate it. But it's hard to know when the calf is only a few months old. What if the calf turns out to be a weakling? You're not going to buy a calf without an insurance policy, are you? A Jewish man, Yahu Azari, the son of Abu Yahu, insures the calf. You have the extended warranty on your car? Right? It's the same thing here. Right? This is the beginning of the insurance business. I mean, it's remarkable. I repeat, we have no idea what these people were doing religiously. I'm going to emphasize that over and over again, in contrast to Egypt, where we'll see something. Here's Shlomo Messiah in 2015. He was a Bukharian Jew, who lived in London, and born in Jerusalem, lived in London, and you see him in his home with various antiquities. Eventually, his collection reached 60,000 items. I'm not even sure where they are today. There's one possible tantalizing clue about the religious life of these people. In other words, all those hundreds of tablets tell us only about what they were doing in the business world. We have no idea what they were doing with festivals and Shabbat and so on. There's one passage in the book of Ezra which refers to Ezra, commanded them unto Edo, the head of Cassiphia, the place. Now, we don't quite know where Kasafia is, but it's referred to here as Hamakom, the Hebrew word Hamakom, the place. What does that mean? Well, some people think that it might refer to some sacred place, some place of worship. What they were doing there, we wouldn't know. Other scholars think it has nothing to do with that at all. But it refers to temple servants, a rare Hebrew word, nitinim, in Kasafia, the place. Okay. So this is a tantalizing clue to maybe there was some sort of physical space where Jews congregated in the exile. Okay. Now, that's Babylonia. The second part of my presentation has to do with Egypt. When the Babylonians, let's go back to 586, or prior to that even, 600. When the Babylonians were attacking or approaching, you had three choices. You could fight, you could surrender, or you could flee in the opposite direction. And many people from Jerusalem fled in the opposite direction, and that meant Egypt. And again, this is all described in especially the book of Jeremiah, but other biblical texts as well. And so they go to Egypt. And this establishes the first diaspora community in the opposite direction, right? This is a almost voluntary diaspora community, not wanting to surrender, not wanting to fight, but just to flee. Remove yourself from the warfare. And they go to Egypt. Now, the passage comes from, the key passages from both Kings, they came to Egypt, and even in more detail, Jeremiah. And it refers to the Judahites who were living in Egypt, and he gives us the names of places: Migdol, Tachpanches, and Noph. They are all in the Delta region. Noph is actually Memphis, which is more or less southern Cairo of today. Migdol and Tachpanches are in the eastern Delta. And then in the land of Patros. So it would make sense that they would go to the Delta because look how close it is. No surprise. In fact, that's the same area that the children of Israel lived in 700 years earlier in the story of the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. But what about the land of Patros? Patros is the southland of Egypt. No, I don't have it there yet. Okay, let's talk about this before we get to Patros. Eventually, Jeremiah was taken to Egypt against his will. In other words, a whole bunch of the people in the city of Jerusalem swept Jeremiah up and took him down to Egypt too. He was opposed to that. He believed that you should just surrender to the Babylonians because in his theology, the Babylonians were the hand of God, which was the human agent of God who had come to punish the Israelites for their wayward ways. But by now, in chapter 43, Jeremiah himself is in this place, Tachpanches in the Delta. And look at this, verse 8. And the word of the Lord was to Jeremiah in Tachpanches. In other words, just like prophets were able to receive the word of God in Babylonia, Jeremiah is able to receive the word of God here in Egypt. Obviously, he was also receiving the word of God in Jerusalem as a prophet, but now in Egypt as well. Patros is the southland. It's the actual Egyptian word for the southland. We have this term in hieroglyphic texts. Why did Jews go so far south? We have no idea. We don't understand why there would have been a Jewish community there as early as the time of Jeremiah. But there they are. And that's an important part of our story. When the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians, they extended the empire to include Egypt, as you see here on the map. And the southern tip of Egypt, which is the southwestern border of the Persian Empire. I don't think I've ever said that in the Southwest, but here I am in the Southwest. In the southwestern portion of the Persian Empire is a town called Elephantine. It got its name because it's where the ivory trade would enter Egypt from further south in Africa. And we don't like to talk about such things, of course, but this was all part of antiquity, and plenty of ivory found in Egyptian excavations, including in King Tut's tomb and so on. So the town got that name. It's the southernmost spot in Egypt. If you go south of there, you encounter the rapids and the cataracts, and you cannot navigate further south. So they created a natural boundary to protect the southern border of Egypt, but Elephantine, which is modern day Aswan, I'll show you in a minute, is right there. Cyrus the Great did not conquer Egypt, but his son and successor Cambyses did. So this map is showing you again Egypt, the Persian Empire at its greatest extent. Here's Elephantine Island. It's really lovely because most of Egypt, like most of Israel, is limestone. Here it's granite. It's an island in the middle of the Nile. The Nile really doesn't have islands except here. And this is where you have this large island of Elephantine. And all of those things on the upper right there, that's downtown Aswan of today. And in that cluster that I just showed you, this is only because I can't not say it. This has nothing to do with Jewish history. It's just all part of the sidebars that illuminate my lecture. This is the old Cataracts Hotel, still standing there, built by Thomas Cook. Everybody remember Thomas Cook traveler's checks? Okay, my students have no idea what a traveler's check is. Okay. Agatha Christie stayed here when she wrote Death on the Nile. Okay. What was Agatha Christie doing in Egypt anyway? Well, her there it is. I'm sorry to say that it's not part of the Sofitel chain, according to the Google Maps. Okay. I've been there, but I didn't stay there. I stayed at a different hotel, and whatever reason, the tour operator put us in a different hotel. But anyway, there's Agatha Christie. Her husband was Max Mallowan, famous Near Eastern archaeologist, who did most of his work in Babylonia, but also visited and worked a little bit in Egypt, which is why Agatha Christie wrote Death on the Nile, Murder on the Orient Express, because they would take the train to Istanbul and so on and so forth. Yes, Agatha Christie was 14 years older than her husband, Max Mallowan, which leads to her all-time great quip. An archaeologist is the best husband a woman can have. The older she gets, the more interested is in her. Okay. Well, I just had to do that because we were in Aswan. But back to our story. Elephantine Island. Around 1900, again, German archaeologists are excavating more or less the same time period that they're excavating in Babylon to bring back the Ishtar gates of Berlin. They're excavating at Elephantine on the island, and they found a Jewish temple. Now, it doesn't look like much to you, or to me for that matter, but it is a temple, and it is Jewish. And this caused quite a shock, because as I said a moment ago, you're not supposed to have another temple except in Jerusalem. So here we are. How do we explain it? How do we know it's Jewish? At the site, the archaeologists found several hundred Aramaic papyri, which refer to all sorts of things, including Passover. I'll show you in a moment. Now, the Jewish temple was right next to the temple to the local Egyptian god known as Khnum. So this is the Jewish temple right here, and this is the temple complex of the god Khnum, who is worshipped in the shape of a ram. And you probably can't read it, but it says right here, Ram Cemetery. That's where the ram mummies were found. Okay, the mummified rams there. He's I wrote creator God. He's not the creator. He's the creator of humanity. So when you look at Egyptian art, you see Khnum on the left, see the ram's head, seated, working on the potter's wheel, creating little humans. It's exactly like Genesis chapter 2, where God creates man out of clay. And in fact, the word that's used there, yotzer, is actually the Hebrew word for a potter. I mean, it's another word for a potter, but it is a potter. Okay, I mean, it's the word that's a potter at work. It's called the yotzer. So what God does is that he yotzers Adam. It's exactly what you see here. On the right is the frog goddess Heket, who is breathing, or is placing the symbol of life into the human's nostrils. Right? That's the sign, the symbol of life. And this is just as an aside, because it's not directly related to what we're doing, but what it shows you, of course, is that in the biblical tradition, God, the single God, does everything. He creates humans out of clay, and he blows the breath of life into their nostrils. That's the wonder of the biblical tradition. In the ancient Near Eastern tradition, every deity would have a separate function, as you see here. Okay. Now, the 200 papyri which were found there by the German archaeologists, discovered during that decade, again, many of them are dated, not all, many of them are dated from around 450 down to 410. The last one is dated to 410 BCE. And they're housed today in 6 separate museums. Most of them are in Cairo and Berlin, but there are a handful in Brooklyn and Oxford, and I think Florence and Padua each have 1 or 2, something like that. In the Brooklyn Museum. I'm going to show that to you. Yeah, 8 of them in the Brooklyn Museum. I'm going to show that. The whole world starts in Brooklyn, right? Yes, Now, this is one of the ones in the Brooklyn Museum. And it's a marriage document. And it's a Jewish man. How do we know he's Jewish? Look at his name, Ananya. And he marries an Egyptian woman named Tamut, an Egyptian name. And in fact, she's a slave woman. And it's all laid out for us in the Aramaic. Now, by the way, this script is exceedingly cursive. I would call it hyper cursive, right? Or uber cursive, uber cursive in German, you would say. It's really difficult to read, but once you get the hang of it, you can read it. And of course, we all rely on our specialist colleagues who have spent a lifetime studying these papyri. And again, they get translated, transcribed, and translated and analyzed. The man, Ananya, purchased a house on the 14th of September, 437 BCE, because it's a contract, therefore it has to have a date. Right? It's the deed, basically. And so we get the names of the people who are selling it, and Ananya is buying it. And he is referred to here with a term that we know from Aramaic texts, probably to pronounce something like lachin or lachain, which is a temple functionary. Not quite a priest, that would be Kohen or Kahan in Aramaic, but clearly some sort of temple functionary. It's beginning to fill in the picture of, whoa, look at that, people working at a temple, a Jewish man working in some temple. We also have, this is all part of the Ananya collection, which is in the Brooklyn Museum. We also have Ananya on 2 separate occasions at a distance of 30 years. In 434, he gave his wife a part of the house, deeded her a part of the house. And in 404, 30 years later, deeded his daughter, wasn't enough room there, daughter, who has a good Hebrew name, Yehovi Shema, and he deeded her another part of the house. Okay, must have been a relatively large house that it could be cut up in some way. You get this room, I get that room, so on and so forth. So we know a lot about this man and his family. And then, because his daughter was the daughter of a slave woman, even though he married her, she was still a slave woman, technically, legally, he eventually manumitted his wife and his daughter, who gave them their legal freedom. Okay, and we have that document. Isn't it amazing? I mean, this is incredible that we can reconstruct an entire man's life and the females in the family. Now, how did they come to the Brooklyn Museum? I think, Lisa, you were asking that question. you can't make these stories up, okay? Charles Wilbur was an autodidact Egyptologist. He was an American journalist who went off to Paris. He spoke fluent French, and he taught himself Egyptology, which was just coming into vogue in the 19th century. I don't have it here, but I believe he's the first English translator of Victor Hugo. So when Les Miserables was translated into English, I believe it was done by Charles Wilbur. And in 1893, just prior to the German archaeologists getting there, he obtained 8 papyrus rolls, small ones, from the locals. In other words, by this point, the locals in Egypt understood that you could just go dig in the dirt or dig in the sand and find anything, and there would be Americans and especially Europeans who would be willing to buy it. Today, that would be illegal. But back in the 19th and for most of the 20th century, in fact, it was legal. There was no restrictions on the exporting or the carrying off of antiquities. I mean, to be honest, that's how, of course, the British Museum and the Louvre and the Met and so on built their collections. He took his 8 papyrus rolls and he placed them in a large biscuit tin for storage. And when he got back to Paris, he placed that little biscuit tin box in his trunk in his hotel room. And then he died. 50 years goes by, and a Paris hotel clerk found the trunk and opened it, and it had his name on it still, and contacted his daughter in the U.S. and sent the contents to the U.S. And the daughter, Theodora Wilbur, donated its contents to the Brooklyn Museum. How's that? You can't make this up. In other words, these precious documents for 50 years were sitting in a hotel storage facility in Paris, in the luggage hold. Did he have a plane ticket? How does this work? I have no idea, right? Right. And those are the Wilbur papyri. And he had other stuff. I mean, I'm talking about the stuff that's related to Jewish history. He had some very important stuff from Ramses II and so on, all now at the British Museum. Sorry, at the Brooklyn Museum. This is at the Brooklyn Museum on Grand Army Plaza. And one of the 8 that they own is on display. And most museums have much more in storage than they are actually able to display. But my colleague, the curator there, has taken me behind the scenes to show me the drawers where the other 7 are kept. So I'm just giving you a sense of how they're kept in these drawers, all beautifully preserved, as you can see here. Now, what were the Jews doing other than having their own temple in Elephantine? The Persian rulers realized that these Jews could be very useful. So these must be the descendants of the Jews who were in Patros, southern Egypt, a century earlier. Why they went to southern Egypt, we still don't know, but they were there when the Persians arrived. That we can figure out by connecting the Jeremiah passage with what happens a century later. And there they are. The Persians had this massive empire. The Persian army is not large enough to patrol the entire empire, all the borders. So who's going to control the border of the south of Egypt? They can't ask the Egyptians because the Egyptians are the conquered, right? They're the ruled. You can't ask them to, give them some armaments and say, here, patrol your border. But the Jews were employed by the Persians to be the soldiers for the Persian army at the south of Egypt. They could protect the border. So the main function of these Jewish people there would have been in a garrison. Soldiers. Now, this is the most remarkable document, the one that very few people know about. But I invite you to learn more about it. Email me, I can send you a translation and introduce it to your Passover Seder. We have one of these papyri. Remember how in Babylonia we knew nothing about what they were doing? Here we know what they're doing, leading a Jewish life. This is the Passover papyrus. It's in the Berlin Museum. It's written on both sides. This one is small. The image is smaller, but if you see, it's just a reverse. It's called the verso, and that's the recto. It's just a mirror image, and so you flip it, and you get the other side of it. But when I created this PowerPoint image, I'm not sure why I made it smaller. I think the acuity on the photo wasn't as good. What does it say? It is a letter addressed by a Jewish person to his fellow Jews. To my brothers, Yedaniah and his colleagues of the Judahite garrison, from your brother Hananiah. Sounding very polytheistic, we'll come back to that. May the gods see the welfare of my brothers. Now this year, the 5th year of King Darius, and that's how we can date it, 419 BCE, word was sent from the king in the month of Nisan. This is the royal decree from Persia, right? The royal decree from the capital in Susa. This is more or less the time of the Esther story. In the month of Nisan, let there be a Passover for the Judahite garrison. Count 14 days in the month of Nisan and keep the Passover from the 15th day to the 21st day. 7 days of unleavened bread. Misspelled, sorry. Be clean and take heed. Do not work on the 15th day and the 21st day. Also drink no intoxicants, and anything in which there is leaven, do not eat. Now, the drink no intoxicants means beer, because that's the national drink of Egypt. Obviously, wine is permitted on Passover. So this text knows a lot about Jewish observed Passover. No leaven food to be eaten, bread, no beer, intoxicant, and you can work on the other days, but you can't work on the 1st and the 7th day of Passover. Everybody following this? And this is the royal decree from the Persian Emperor. Yeah.
How does this compare to the canonization?
To the
canonization of the Torah? Time and repeat her question.
Yeah, I will. So Rabbi Steinkoven asked, how does this compare? How does this relate to the canonization of the Torah? So the question is, when did that happen? If you associate the canonization of the Torah with Ezra, which I'm inclined to do, that would be 20 or 30 years prior to this. But even without that, Passover was obviously being observed, even if for generations, for hundreds of years, even if the text wasn't what we would call a canonical text yet. So it's relevant, but it doesn't really relate if you just assume we know Passover was celebrated at the time of Josiah, 200 years earlier, and so on. But this is an amazing text. And even in verse 9, don't bring any leaven into your houses. Seal it up during those days. Tape up your kitchen cabinets. Let this be done as King Darius commanded. So we live in a country where today, right, where if Jewish soldiers in the U.S. Army want to observe Passover, we have, military chaplains in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and so on. I know several myself. One of my former students who went on to rabbinical school is now a chaplain in the U.S. Navy station in Okinawa. He's posting on Facebook. I built a sukkah on the base. I mean, these are wonderful things that we have. This is 2,500 years ago. Jewish soldiers are being given the days off so they could observe Passover. This is incredible. By the Persian Empire. Okay, there's the temple again. This is an artist's reconstruction, an artist archaeologist's reconstruction of what the temple looked like, laid out more or less like the Jerusalem temple, rectangular in shape, and the altar with the smoke going up in the outer courtyard in front of the temple. Okay. Although these clearly are Jewish people, as we can tell from their names and observing Passover, there's another element of their life here called syncretism. Syncretism is when you're not only observing your own religion, you are bringing in elements from polytheistic religions or from other religions. And so this little papyrus text, also in Berlin, a Jewish person named Menachem Bar Shalom, he swore to Meshulam Bar Natan by the Lord, the God of Israel, and by the temple, swearing, and then by Anat Yahu. Who's that? Anat is a Canaanite goddess. So this looks like a fusion between Anat, the female goddess of the Canaanites, and Yahu, short for the name of the God of Israel. Or this one. It's a list of donors to the temple. You have a plaque like that here in the building somewhere? Nothing's changed, folks. Except it's on a papyrus. It's a record of who has donated what to the temple in Elephantine. And this individual, by his name, we know he's Jewish, Yedonia Bar Gemaria, in such and such a month. It's an Egyptian month name. He gave this amount for Yahu, and also for Ishum Bethel, a polytheistic deity, and for Anat Bethel, polytheistic goddess. I mean, I don't want to make a joke out of it. It's like he's covering all the bases. I think I'll donate a little bit to all the different deities, right? But that's the syncretism that's happening here. These percolate into our text, even in the Bible from time to time. And of course, although this is the very end of the biblical period and the prophet Malachi, the last of the prophets, was probably already deceased by this point, when we see these things, we have to remind ourselves that the prophets in the Bible, especially Hosea, but others, are always reprimanding the people for engaging in polytheistic work. So when you see these things, it's almost confirmation of the biblical record. I mean, these prophets must have known what they were talking about. Now, this is a little bit later than that, but it shouldn't come as a full surprise that these things are going on. Okay, what happened? This text, very well preserved, very long, is a petition from this community to the governor of Judea in Jerusalem, the Jewish governor in Jerusalem, which would have been not Nehemiah, but one of Nehemiah's successors. Nehemiah was almost undoubtedly deceased by this point. And he described what happened. He's writing to the governor of Judea. Yeb is the Egyptian word for Elephantine. We use the Greek name, but Yeb is the native Egyptian name. He refers to how the Egyptians attacked our Jewish fortress at Yeb. They entered the temple, they destroyed the temple, and they broke the whole thing down, and that's been in ruins ever since. That's what the archaeologists found. Even though we have been worshiping God here in this temple, in this place, since the time of Cambyses, when we built the temple, that was the Persian emperor, and no one ever did any harm to our temple. So we've been here for 100 plus years, doing fine, until this event happened. Why did the local Egyptians turn and attack the Jews? Well, the Persian Empire itself is beginning to weaken a little bit by this point. It would come to an end 70 years later. But there was another issue. They're asking for funds to help us rebuild the temple. Here, our temple. And we have the response from the Judean authorities as well. The other reason, it's not stated in our text, but we do in fact intuit this. We infer this from the whole picture. And that's why I took a moment to show you the ram-headed God. What's the number one sacrifice according to the Torah that your Jews are supposed to do? Rams. And so it was the misfortune, as it were, of the Jewish community to be sacrificing rams right next to the temple where the ram was venerated. And this must have incurred the wrath of the Egyptians. We can't prove that, but I certainly believe that that's the case. And therefore, the local Egyptians finally were able to sort of express themselves in their anger and turn on the Jewish community and destroy the temple. By the way, there's no reference to any loss of life in these texts. It's just that they destroyed our temple. And so they want the Jews back in Jerusalem to help them out. And the response comes from Jerusalem. These Jews in Jerusalem could not have been very happy with the fact that there was a quote-unquote rival temple in Elephantine. But they also wanted to ensure that the Persians would be happy because the Jews were very happy living under the Persians. They had allowed the temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt, and Jews lived and prospered under the Persians. And so the response comes back that you can rebuild the temple, but look on the right text box, line 10 and 11, but do not sacrifice any sheep, oxen, goats, etc. You can only do incense and what's called the meal offering, the mincha, the grain offering. No animal sacrifices. Because the core of the worship service is the animal sacrifices, and the incense and the grain offering are sort of on the side. And so the Jerusalem authorities would be okay with you doing sort of the minor elements of the temple service, and also you won't incur the wrath of your neighbors by sacrificing animals, not only sheep but anything else. So these are all part of the story that we're telling. And the last dated text, this was 409. 409, the temple was destroyed. 407, they got a response back. The last dated text is from our friend Ananya in 402, where he sold, he must have been very old by this point, where he sold the remainder of his house to his son-in-law. That's the end of the community. And as far as we know, they never rebuilt the temple. They continued to live there, presumably. We just don't have a lot of information beyond the year 400, when the archaeological evidence disappears for us. But what we learned from this is that Jews prospered in a diaspora from the very beginning, both in Babylonia, which is where we started this evening, and also in Egypt, even if the Egyptian story comes to a somewhat tragic end, again, not necessarily with loss of life, but at least with the destruction of their temple. And those are the first diasporas. And here we are 2,500 years later, and without involving ourselves in the events of 2024, by and large, Jewish diaspora communities still exist around the world, following in the traditions and the footsteps of these ancestors of 2.5 millennia ago. Thank you very much.
Any questions? I will start in the room and then we'll go to.
Okay. Yes, sir.
One thing that occurred to me is that on the screen, the years were regnal years.
Correct.
Rulers. And how you convert those regnal years to a calendar that we recognize.
Right. Okay. Yeah, well, yeah, thanks. The question is, year 33 of Nebuchadnezzar, or year 10, or whatever it was of Darius, how do we know that that's, 572 BCE or 433 BCE or whatever it is? The people of Mesopotamia in particular, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, kept annals with astronomical observations, including eclipses of the sun, eclipses of the moon, and planetary alignments. And so once we have that information, we go to our astronomy colleagues and say, so when were there are only 5 planets visible from the naked eye, right? When were Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn all aligned in the same part of the sky, visible in Babylon or something like that? And it happens only once every couple of centuries or something. And a solar eclipse could have happened then. And that can all be dated astronomically. And once we have that, we can pinpoint exactly the year. Does that help? And since we know how long every king reigned, because we have very good records from this time period, we can do chronology. Even if we don't have an astronomical observation from King A or B, if we have it from King C and D, and we know when they reigned and how long they reigned, we can create this chronology. The years are off by no more than 1 or 2 years.
Did they have a calendar back?
Only a monthly calendar for a year. Everything else was by regnal year. Correct. Yeah. Right.
I wanted to know if there's any evidence from the Babylonian Elephantine with context to Israel.
No. In fact, We have pretty good continuous evidence for the Jewish community in Egypt. I mean, it won't be long after this when Alexander the Great incorporates Egypt into his empire, and we get good Greek documentation and the beginnings of a synagogue and the translation of the Torah into Greek, all of that. The oddest thing is that we have almost nothing about Babylonia. After these cuneiform tablets, which I showed you, we have almost no information about the Jews of Babylonia. Now, they must have been there forever. They must have never stopped living there. We have the occasional reference in Josephus later on, of course, and then eventually we get the Babylonian Talmud when Babylon becomes the greatest center of Jewish learning. But that's 1,000 years down the road. But this community must have just continued to exist, but we have no reference to the two of them talking to each other or communicating with each other. As you can see, they sent letters to Jerusalem, but they did not send any letters that far away. Yeah.
So,
Go ahead. Yeah.
about the time of the formation of Israel, the Jews were expelled from Iran. Were these the descendants of the original Babylonian Jews?
Most likely, yes. In other words, the Jews of Iraq and the Jews of Iran. Let's start with Iraq, because that's where Babylonia is. The Jews of Iraq of the 20th century are the descendants of this community. And the Jews of Iran are a movement of those Iraqi Jews one country further east.
I see, because they were expelled about the time the formation of Israel.
Well, the Iranian Jews were not, the Iraqi Jews were.
The Iraqi Jews, and I know this personally because I have a friend whose family was expelled, and she went to Israel, and her family went to Los Angeles.
From Iraq or Iran?
From, I don't know, I don't know if it was
Yeah,
Iraq.
I mean, Iranian Jews started leaving en masse, but they were not until the 1970s, basically.
Okay,
Yeah.
but these people were expelled.
Yeah, that was probably Iraq.
I'm gonna jump in and ask one of the questions.
Go ahead, let's hear from the chat.
But I need you to repeat the question.
Yes, I will.
Okay, so could you talk about the Torah scrolls during the exile to Babylonia in 586 BC?
So the questions about Torah scrolls from Babylonia in 586, and of course we could say the same thing about Egypt, right? Right. First of all, at that time period, I cheated a little bit, those were parchment scrolls. At that time period, everything was still written on papyrus. So we have no evidence whatsoever, right? No evidence whatsoever. The dating of biblical texts is a thorny issue about which, or a contested issue, I should say. It's actually very clear, cut, and simple, if you follow my view, which is that the Torah was, I'm sure, written and completed by that point. It doesn't have any of the influences of Babylonian or Persian or any of the languages that are of that time period. None of those influences are to be found in the Torah. They are found in books like Ezekiel, who's obviously writing in the exile, and in the book of Esther, which is obviously about a story that takes place in the exile. So they would probably took with them their papyrus scrolls, but we have no physical evidence. Again, it's all biodegradable material. And even from Egypt, we don't have until we get down to the Elephantine period. But again, no Torah scrolls, no biblical texts in that collection, which is unfortunate. It would have been wonderful if we would have been able to find one or two scraps out of the 200, but they're not there.
Don't forget that.
Yes, okay, let's go. I'm sorry, yes, gentlemen, you had your hand up first.
So the tradition of the Torah from that time period was all oral and then got rewritten again later on?
Oh, no, I'm not saying they didn't have it in writing. We just don't have the physical evidence. I assume they had it in writing. And people also would have known it orally, both. They would have had it in writing and they would have had people who knew it orally. And when the kingdom of Judah is destroyed and the people dispersed to Egypt and Babylonia and wherever, they would have taken their sacred texts with them physically if they had copies, or people who knew it by heart. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
But the Talmud was written much later.
That's 1,000 years later. Yeah, right. And that comes out of a much different cultural milieu. Yes.
There's a commentary that there's no evidence that there was an exodus from Egypt, that Jewish people had an exodus. Through any of this or your studies, is that necessarily a true statement?
Well, I'm sorry that you missed my talk.
Let me get you a chair.
No, I'm fine. Lisa, this is fine.
Are you sure?
I'm positive. Yeah.
Okay.
I gave a talk at Phoenix Seminary on Monday evening all about that. So there is plenty of evidence for the Exodus, right? And then I gave it yesterday at Beth Emet, actually the same talk. There is plenty of evidence for it, and I've written on it. And if you want to, I can, go to my website or whatever. I can direct you to my publication. It's a co-authored article, but there's plenty of evidence from Egypt and from archaeology which demonstrates what we call the historicity of the Exodus.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying this.
Not necessarily in the grand, not necessarily in the grand manner that the Torah describes. I'm not going to sit here and tell you there were 600,000 Israelite adult males and so on and so forth. But the core narrative has a historical core. Let's just say that.
Is it also like a rock in Egypt or something? Hieroglyphics that told us?
The word Israel, no, but the word Israel does appear on one hieroglyphic inscription.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you introduce into the context, the book of Esther and the Persian Jews? Just where can you
Right.
briefly say where that fits in?
So the gentleman asked a question about the book of Esther. How does that fit into this? So the book of Esther has to come to us more from the place of lore than anything else. We have no evidence of any Persian, and we have pretty good documentation. We have no evidence of any Persian persecution of the Jews. So when I said that the Jews flourished in the Persian Empire for 200 years, that is correct. We also don't know if it was possible for a Jewish woman to become the queen. That's another problem. We have a reference from our ancient documentation which says that all the queens came from one of 7 noble families. But how about, we have little bits of information that we try to hold on to. That said, the names Esther and Mordecai are part of that time period and part of that culture, fascinatingly evoking the names of Babylonian deities, Ishtar and Marduk. How did Jews get those names? Right. So there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot in the story that is historical, sort of like the Exodus question that we just had. Ahasuerus is perfectly identifiable with the king who is known as Xerxes. We know the Persians held lavish banquets. There are plenty of good Persian words in the story. We know the Persians sent letters across the entire empire in multiple languages, exactly what it says in the book of Esther. So there are elements there that fit into the time period, but there's nothing that we can pin to a historical event, and certainly not, a person named Haman is not known from any historical documents. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Were the Jews taken to Babylon to be slaves?
So the question is, were the Jews taken to Babylon to be slaves? And I didn't mention that, so thanks for the question. The answer is essentially yes. But it's not necessarily slaves. The Bible tells us that the Babylonians left the poorest people back in the land. They did not take them away into exile. And it refers to them as the wine dressers, in other words, people who tended to vines, vine dressers and other such things. What we would call today farmhands or something. The people who were taken off were the royal family, the nobles, the aristocrats, and the people who had real talent. Engineers, architects, scribes, metalsmiths. So they were put to work, but now we're working for the Babylonians. We don't know enough about what they were doing, what the legal or economic status was. But you can see that even while Nebuchadnezzar was still king, Jews are engaged in commerce, so they couldn't have been slaves. If I'm hesitant in answering some of the questions, it's because for lack of evidence. To quote one of my Israeli colleagues, when we study the ancient world, how's this for a lovely metaphor? When we study the ancient world, all we have are islands of information in a sea of ignorance. Little bits of pieces. A century could go by with no documentation of anything. I love that, islands of information in a sea of ignorance.
Can I jump in with another question?
Go ahead, Lisa.
Could the Hananiah in the Passover papyrus be the Hanani, Nehemiah's brother, and successor as the administrator in Judea?
Probably not, because that family came from this family is from Egypt, in Egypt, and Nehemiah and his brother would have come from Babylonia. So probably just, and the name Hananiah is very common. There are many, many people named Hananiah in the ancient records. Yeah. Which, by the way, means grace of God, or God is gracious. Beautiful name. Yeah. Go ahead.
I have one more.
Go ahead.
Okay. So don't forget to repeat, but did Jews in Egypt also incorporate elements of Persian religion or just primarily Egyptian?
Okay, so the question is, did the Jews in Egypt, or even Babylonia for that matter, where they're even closer to Persia, incorporate any elements of Persian religion? So that's a whole other lecture. The ancient religion of Persia is Zoroastrianism. It still exists today. About 125,000 Zoroastrians in the world, very small minority. Some tiny communities in America, tiny communities remaining in Iran, but most of them living in India, where they're called the Farsis, especially in Mumbai. And they moved eastward from Iran to India during the time of Muslim persecutions. There are plenty of Zoroastrian influences in Judaism and in Christianity, including ideas such as apocalyptic and dualism, but just giving you throwing out some words here, because seriously, the concept of, it all gets tied in with dualism, the concept of a devil, of a Satan as the counterforce to God, that actually comes into Judaism out of Zoroastrian belief. And then it gets adopted even more so by Christianity. So there is influence. And although I also want to say that the Zoroastrians never imposed their religion on anybody. In other words, all these kings, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, they were all Zoroastrians. But they never imposed their religion on peoples, quite the contrary. As you've seen, they allowed the Jews in particular to be a thriving minority in their realm. But as I like to say, you don't rule the world for 200 years without influencing the way people think. And therefore, some of these would have been started seeping into to Judaism and eventually also into Christianity. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So you showed I think it was the papyrus of the Egyptian, the Jew who was living in Egypt and married a slave.
Right.
So I always thought that that we had matrilineal descent always. That didn't seem like that was a situation where we did. So can you explain that?
Yes, okay.
And don't forget to repeat that.
Right, okay. So Lisa asks, if this Jewish man married an Egyptian woman, the daughter has a good Hebrew name and she's clearly Jewish, where's the matrilineal descent issue? In the biblical period, it's all patrilineal, including in this society here. You were what your father was. That was the whole Near Eastern way. So if you just go to biblical stories, such as Joseph, who marries an Egyptian woman, and Moses, who marries a Midianite woman, and so on, their offspring are all part of the people of Israel. Later, in the Roman period, it shifted from a patrilineal to a matrilineal system for reasons that are still not clear and are still debated. And that's the way Judaism has been for the last almost 2,000 years, probably. But why the shift occurred, we don't know. All sorts of theories have been thrown out. None of them are provable. So it's another one of these examples where we have a black hole, more islands of information in a sea of ignorance. And that's basically all we can say about it. But yeah, there would have been no issue. Right.
So the last person asked is, can you explain what canonization is?
Canonization. What is canonization? It is the most difficult term to define. I use it in class, and I never know how to teach it to my students, and they never quite grasp it either, because I don't teach it correctly or whatever. So the best way to say it is canon with only one N in the middle, C-A-N-O-N, right? It means that a sacred text, or rather a text, has achieved a level of sanctity, of sacredness, that it is seen as canonical to the entire religious tradition. You're not supposed to define a word by using the same word as the definition. That's why we all have trouble defining it. So the Torah becomes canonical for Jews in the 5th century B.C.E. It may exist earlier. It always certainly did, based on the linguistic profile of the text. The prophets would be canonized later. The writings would be canonized later. In Christianity, the New Testament would be canonized later. But it's something like an accepted body of sacred literature. And certain books don't make it into the canon. And sometimes we have references to them, and we may even have some remnants of them. But what I can say, and it's a great way to end the evening, is that as far as we can tell, Judaism was the first religion to do such a thing. Because most religions in the ancient world, I won't say most, all religions in the ancient world were temple-centered. You worship your God in the temple. They had written texts. We have a Babylonian creation story about Marduk. It's wonderful, right? Christian texts about the god Horus and the god Ra and the goddess Isis. They have these texts about their deities. But the Jews were the first ones to take their text and move it, or give it an upgrade. And it has to do with more and more devotion to the written text, side by side temple worship. That's the best we can say about it. Yeah. Thank you very much.
This was terrific, and I remind you.
Next week.
That's right. Next week we continue. I'll give you exactly the title will be What Happened to the Jews After 70 CE. So after the destruction of the Second Temple. That's our next focus. And please join us online next Thursday and the Thursday after that.
You'll get to see me from my home office.
From my home office.